Hi, my name's Andrew Dipper. I've run Dipper Restorations for 40 years, I think, so far. One of my expertise is in antique violin bows. And we started making violin bows because it became very, very difficult to match antique bows with antique instruments. There simply weren't enough bows left to be able to do that. So I started making copies of antique bows. But I'd like to talk to you today about the history of the violin bow. We try and make a timeline out of the history. In fact, it's not quite a timeline. There's the development, but the development is not a single line. It breaks up into many parts and comes back to meet itself and then breaks again. So it's more like a tree where the branches knit together than it is a single line. The first kind of bow probably came from India and from the Arab countries. And this bow was fairly plain. It was basically a stick on which horsehair was stretched. I have a fragment of one here, which is probably from India. You can see that it makes a bow shape, and that's the normal shape of an antique bow. It's from the Renaissance. It's got a curve to it, but it's outwardly curved, not inwardly curved, rather like an archery bow. Most of the woods that they used were tropical hardwoods that were fairly easy to find. That is from India and from the Arabian Peninsula and places like that. But no woods from South America. It didn't have tropical hardwoods in the 1500s. So after this kind of bow, the Europeans, after the medieval period where they were using this kind of simple stick, the Europeans invented a different kind of bow, and this probably came into use around the end of the 1500s, and this is the clip-in type. And you can see that the bow itself has an outward curve to it, not like the modern bow, which has the curve the other way. This bow has a frog which is not worked with an adjuster. It has what we call a clip-in frog. I can take it out for a second. The frog is quite loose and comes out quite naturally. And the hair, instead of being fixed into the frog, is fixed into the stick on this end. So both ends of the hair are fixed into the stick. I just have to be careful to put this back in because it's a little tricky to do. I have to make sure that the hair is running in the channel that goes around the top of the frog. So the channel extends all the way down to that where the hair is held. So that's clipped in. If it needs to be adjusted, it can be adjusted by sliding a piece of cardboard under the hair. So no adjustment at the end. Adjustment's very limited. And if it gets very, very humid, you end up with a huge piece of cardboard or leather back here to adjust the tension. This one has a grip on. The hold for a bow of this kind was a little higher than the modern bow up here. The Italians sometimes even held it up higher, whereas the French held it lower down in the stick. After this kind of bow, there was a second kind of bow, which is adjustable. It's called a cramaillère, and it has a hoop of metal that engages with a ratchet on top of the stick. So if you want to move the frog backwards, you move it backwards. And then that little hoop tightens up on the ratchet and prevents the frog from slipping backwards. So this was before anybody started to make a mechanism inside the frog. The mechanism on the bow originated probably around the end of the 1600s. And you can see, this is an antique bow, and you can see the mortise here. Here is the eyelet. That's the piece that the screw goes into, a little piece of steel or bronze. And these fittings, this one is bone. Sometimes the fittings were of ivory, if they were for luxury items, but the ordinary bow was bone. And you see this one is cowbone. As you tighten the screws so that the frog moves backwards, and that again tightens the hair. With this kind of bow, you have a lot more movement in the frog than you do with the crémaillère. So it's much, much more adjustable. After this bow, which you can see already has the higher head of the modern bow, there was this period of development of bows for orchestra and for playing opera, and they had what's called a Kramer head on it. And the Kramer head has a little palette on the back here, and the palette strengthens the mortise, because what they found when they started to play at higher tension was that the back of the bow broke out. So to prevent that, they extended the back of the bow and included a little bit more of the tip plate here behind the mortise. The other problem was at this time that the heads of the bows tended to break. They didn't yet know the strength of the material that they were using, because the early bows are made of snakewood, which is quite a durable material. When they switched over to Pernambuco, they found that Pernambuco wasn't strong enough, and that the heads of the bows broke off, particularly when they started to play for opera and for larger performances where they needed more volume. So the Kramer family invented this kind of bow where the head is relatively wide, and that width made the head stronger. So this bow fell out of use probably by 1830. So it's a bow type that is not often used these days. The frog of this is not original. The original frogs had an open hair channel. You can see here, there's no silver on the bottom of the frog at all. It's an open channel, and the hair simply sits in along that open channel. It's held in place because it's curved here. It's cambered, and that camber makes the hair naturally slide outwards and stops it bunching together. Around 1760 or so, the Tort family of Paris decided that they were going to make this kind of ferrule. And first they made it out of tin, and later out of silver. And that ferrule surrounds the hair, and there's a wedge that goes in there that I think has been explained before to keep the hair ribbon at a certain width. The early bows generally had a hair width rather smaller than today. This one is probably around 8 millimeters. Yeah, it's about 8 millimeters across the hair ribbon, whereas the modern hair width is slightly larger than that. One of the problems when orchestras started to get larger was volume. And one of the ways that you can increase volume is to increase the tension of the violin. And this was done by making the strings thicker. The problem is with the short bow, which is this one, the shorter bow didn't give the right articulation with the thicker strings. And so just at this time when the strings started to get thicker and audiences increased and performances started to get longer, they increased the length of the bow, which gives a little more weight and helps for the articulation of the bow. The other thing that you can see, apart from the hair ribbon width, I put those two together, you can see that the first hair ribbon is quite narrow, and the second later hair ribbon tends to be quite large. And that does have a more or less linear development. You can see that as time goes on, the hair ribbons get larger and larger and larger, and the number of hairs get more and more, finishing with the modern bow. I think the Tort bow has about 110 to 150 hairs in it, whereas the modern bow has more than that. One of the other developments of the bow was, I don't know if you can see this properly, but it's cannellation. It's the stick has flutes running all the way up the stick, and those flutes make the bow more flexible. And this style came in around the end of the 1600s and lasted perhaps 30 or 40 years. And that helped with snakewood, which is relatively stiff. It helped with the articulation of the bow. And they copied the cannellations from the Greek columns. It's exactly the same as the column that you might see on the front of a church, or something like that. When at the beginning of the 1700s, the bow was relatively, the heads were quite low. They're called pike heads. By 1720, the heads started to get larger and started to get longer, and that was because to get harmonics on the instrument is very difficult with what's called a pike head bow. The dynamics are basically loud and soft. In order to get a different kind of tone color, it helps to have a higher head. And Tartini, when he started writing for the violin, found that the higher head produced much better harmonics than other kinds of pike head bows. This is what we normally call a pike head. It's not very high. It can be made out of a very small piece of wood. And of course, at this time when these bows were being made, snakewood was extremely expensive. Came from South America. The shipping was expensive, and it was very difficult to get logs which didn't have cracks in. So having a low head helps. By the end of the 1700s, it was possible to get large supplies of snakewood from South America, that is from what's now Suriname and Guyana. And so it's possible to make heads of the bows with a higher head by that time. Tartini introduced with his music lots and lots of different kinds of dynamics, and he hated to play with accompaniment. And so he invented a method of playing where it was possible for him to produce harmonics and other kinds of sounds. And one of those is called the third sound. It happens when you play two other notes perfectly in tune. And he found that this kind of bow helped tremendously with those kinds of dynamics. And so after Tartini found that out, around 1727, you see a development of the violin bow until, I suppose, about 1770 or 1780, when Tort started to produce the modern bow. Just to finish up, because I didn't cover this, with frogs, and the frog goes through a number of different iterations at the end of the 1800s. This is a bow by William Tubbs from England, but when he was working, they only had the silver ferrule. They didn't have anything else, and you see there's no metal on the back of the frog at all, and very little metal on the adjuster. You have the same. I can take this out so you can see it. This is an original bow. You can see it has a metal underslide as well that protects the bottom of the frog. So these were all modern solutions to an engineering problem, because basically the bow is an engineering problem. It has to stay straight and it has to stay strong. It mustn't give out over time, which is why certain woods were chosen. Pernambuco, which is, this is an original bow, English viola bow, and this bow is Pernambuco. This was the wood that replaced snakewood, which is this is a snakewood bow, and you can see the difference of color, dark chocolate brown. And snakewood is called snakewood or letterwood because it has mottling like a snake up in the stick. In South America, they used it for spears and archery bows. So it's a very useful wood. Rather rare, It's one of the most expensive woods in the world. It's very much of a problem these days that these tropical hardwoods are extremely endangered. Luckily, a lot of them are being plantation grown, and there's not much demand for snakewood. It's a very difficult wood to use, and it can't be used for anything but violin bows because it cracks very easily. Otherwise, the English use some African hardwoods like ironwood and other kinds of things. But again, it's always an engineering problem. It's which wood is going to be the most elastic and the most durable. Yeah, thank you for joining me today, and I hope that this will suggest a lot of questions, because it's a very complex subject. And anyway, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you soon.